Turn it over to you, Gumaraj, for sharing some wonderful things about Prabhupada today, your insights.
Good morning. Umajnana timirandasya jnananjana salakaya chakshurmilitam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Swami Shri Bhakti Vedanta Prabhupadaya Te Namaha. Guravagyam Shirasi Ritva Shaktya Swarupine Hare Krishna iti mantrena paschatya pachatarane Vishvacharya prabharya Dibhya karunya murtaye Shri Bhagavatu Madhurya Gita Jnana Pradayane Gaura Shri Rupa Siddhanta Saraswati Nishevine Radha Krishna Padam Bhoja Bingaya Gurave Namaha Devam Divyatanum Suchanda Varanam Balarka Chelanchitam Sandrananda Puram Sareka Varanam Vairagya Vittam Buddhim Shisiddhanta Nidhim Subhakti Lasitam Saraswatanambaram Pandetam Shubhadam Madheka Sharanam Nyashishwaram Sridharam Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimade Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Namane Shri Varshavanavi Devi Daitaya Kripabdaye Krishna Sambandha Vidyana Daine Prabhave Namaha Madhudvala Premadhya Shri Rupanuga Bhaktira Shri Gaura Karuna Shakti Vigrahaya Namastate Namaste Gauravani Shri Murtaye Dinatarine Rupanuga Virdhapa Siddhanta Dhantarine Mogora Kishorai Sakshad Vairagya Murtaye Vipralambara Sambore Padambujayate Namaha Bhakti Vinodaya Satchidanandana Gaur Shakti Surupaya Rupanuga Varayate Vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sahodigo Vardhai Pushpavanto Chitro Sando Tumano Vandeham Shri Ramakrishna Abhaya Charana Sako Sukhado Paramanando Sundaro Subhapriyo Namaste Girirajaya Shri Govardhana Namane Seshakleshanashaya Paramananda Daine Tapta Kanchanurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Prishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Oho Bhagyam Nandagopa Bhajokasam Yanmitram Paramanandam Puna Brahma Sanatanam Yanmitram Paramanandam Purna Brahma Sanatanam. Shri Gauri Vaishnava Guru Parampara ki jai. Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Tirobhava Mamotibhati ki jai. So nice to be with all of you today on the auspicious occasion in which we are remembering Pujyapada Sri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and that in the context of his Tirobhava disappearance, passing from the world. And we'll speak a little bit about that, but I want to try to bring a little bit of focus to where, in a broad sense, Prabhupada was internally at the time of his passing. And to look at that or consider that in light of where he was in his principal preoccupation. In other words, Prabhupada, as you know, had a huge mission, worldwide campaign, the likes of which has not been seen in Gaudiya Vaishnavism before, and is analogous to, in the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the wide dispensation of Nityananda Prabhu. Mahaprabhu relied upon him, Nityananda Prabhu, to take his dispensation, even to places where he as a sannyasi could not go. So, as such, there were many things that Prabhupada was concerned with. There were temples, there were problems that arose in the temples. There were many disciples who, of course, some of whom corresponded with him. And there's a whole series, a number of volumes of books that just constitute his correspondence. So managing, organizing, corresponding with devotees, and always expanding the mission as well. These were obviously things that Prabhupada was preoccupied with. But far and above this, he was preoccupied with his writing. And as you know, he invested considerable time in that in Braj when he resided at the Radha Damodar temple, in terms of bringing out his, along with the Back to Godhead magazine, which he did on a regular basis, his commentary, translation, English translation commentary on the first canto of the Bhagavatam, which he came to the Americas with. That was in his trunk. And even upon arriving, and at which time he said he didn't know whether to turn left or right in the Boston Harbor. I guess he turned left and went south to New York. There, even while living homelessly practically for some time, he eventually established a base, of course, and the movement exploded. The history is there. But inside of all of that, if you will, his principal preoccupation was with the ongoing translation of the Bhagavatam, which, along with, came translation, the commentary on Bhagavad Gita, the Nectar of Devotion, which was a summary study of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the teachings of Lord Chaitanya, which was basically a summary of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which Prabhupada referred to. Teachings of Lord Chaitanya is the only book he wrote. In other words, it wasn't a commentary on anything, but largely it is a retelling of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. That happens to be the first, we used to call them big books, that I was able to successfully distribute. In those days, mostly we were selling Back to Godhead magazines, and one devotee told me, his name was Sarvabhauma Das, you should sell big books too. I said, well, I don't know how to do that. And he said, well, you just pray to Prabhupada. So I thought, yeah, that's how everything works. You just pray to Prabhupada. So that night I took a rest praying to Prabhupada that I would figure out how to, get the power to sell one of his big books. And so I brought one along with me just in case. And sure enough, while I was offering it Back to Godhead to someone, they said, well, what's the big book? And I had even forgotten that I had it, I think, with me at the time. And the book sold itself, obviously. So the magic of it all was was right there for everybody to experience in what's some have referred to as the Hare Krishna explosion. Um, um, so there were also some small books that he wrote. I guess he meant the only big book I've written is the Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And all I should say, all of this with within the context of his main principal focus, which was the translation commentary on Grantaraj, that is the very heart of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that all of the other texts really are derived from. I consider it the theological sequel to the Gita. Chaitanya Charitamrita is the distilled essence of the Bhagavatam. All of the Goswami's books um, derive from it, and so forth. So to translate this in English for the first time and to bring out a commentary on it in English as well, this was the principal preoccupation of Prabhupada throughout everything else that was going on around him, which is really hard to imagine. I keep myself here with as little contact with management and relative considerations and so forth to squeak out a couple of books here and there. So, of course, while he did that in great style and was prolific with regard to his literary contribution, as I'm mentioning, he didn't always cross his T's and dot his I's. So I consider my service to be something like that. Just a little small addition, which takes a little more time, a little more concentration on small details. But what he did in terms of publishing was obviously extraordinary, and that, as I say, in the light of being preoccupied with so many other things in the context of the mission. But he would return to this, of course, nightly. I remember once staying in Vrindavan and had a room in the guest house from which I could see out the window the balcony, kind of upper, I guess you'd call it balcony or veranda in Prabhupada's quarters. In his quarters, there was a staircase, went up and came up outside with like a porch out there, veranda. And so he would, on warm nights in Vrindavan, he would sit up there after we had taken rest. And that's when he would focus on his writing. Throughout the day, he'd be busy talking with dignitaries, professors, whoever we brought to him, giving classes, taking a morning stroll for his health, which became also which was also a place for philosophical and discussion, traveling, throughout the world to the different centers and so on and so forth. Sometimes also giving class at night, or at least darshan to some devotees, or as I say, someone that devotees brought, and so forth. A busy day he kept, a busy schedule. And as we did under his direction as well, but we took rest at 9, 10 o'clock, get up at 4, try to stay awake during the day, dangerously at times, while driving. We probably needed a little more rest at times, but we were rather well, we were enthused. But we both, Prabhupada and ourselves, under his direction, kept a busy schedule, but his schedule didn't end when ours did, taking rest at 10 o'clock. He would stay up and write by himself, alone. Write is not entirely accurate way of describing how he brought out his commentaries and translations. He actually used a dictaphone, so he would speak into it, and then later that would be transcribed and edited and turned into the books. But as I was saying, at one time I was staying in Vrindavan in the guest house, and Prabhupada was there, and from my room I could see the veranda where Prabhupada would translate. So I would get up when I realized that one night, after getting up to answer the call of nature, I gazed out the window at the supernatural activities of his divine grace. To my amazement, of course, I think we knew it, that he wrote at night, kind of, but it wasn't something that I really thought about. And it really struck me at that point. We were all sleeping comfortably here, and there he is up for 4 more hours or 2 more, 3, whatever it was, hours, and in solitude, he's bringing out the books for us. Such an extraordinary labor of love and ability to be focused, again, in the midst of all that was going on in ISKCON. So I was quite startled by that. Then I would get up every night and watch him as long as I could stay awake to work on his Bhagavatam, ongoing Bhagavatam translation and commentary. And he had a desire to bring out the whole of the text, beginning from text 1 all the way to the end, almost 18,000 slokas. But as it turned out, Krishna couldn't wait that long to have him back, to take him into his fold, to fulfill Prabhupada's own stated ambition to enter into the friendly embrace of Krishna and in the Braj. Tomano milani bai abar sheshu kupai gochurani guridhin bo kottabani chuttu chuti bani kai lutuputi shedin kobe hobe more. This was his ardent prayer that he wrote upon just before arriving in the United States aboard the Jaladuta. The second part of the prayer, where he aspires to, upon completing the preaching mission that he was given by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, to enter into the Braj Leela throughout the day, wander herding cows through the pastures and forests with Krishna and his friends, as the verse says in his own Bengali, somersaulting, tumbling, rolling playfully in sport with Krishna. When, oh when, he said, will that day be mine? So in the context of his Bhagavatam translation, which is his primary preoccupation, and I mean to say by that, if everything else fell apart, which could happen in a mission, sometimes it happened, somebody in a temple who was in charge got distracted by the force of the external energy and took money and left. It happens. A lot of things happened in ISKCON which would keep you up at night if it was the movement that you were managing. But what kept Prabhupada up at night was his book writing, regardless of what happened in ISKCON. Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, of course, had set a standard for him, and related it to him in Radhakund on the Brajmandal Parakram one year when he told my Guru Maharaj that when the Param Prabhupada told Prabhupada, when his Prabhupada told him that if you ever get money, print books, and we can sell them marbles, as he would say, in the temple to get money to print books. He had struggled, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, to open a marble temple, which was a big thing in those days in Calcutta, which was outside of the Dham. Vaishnavas, Gaudiya Vaishnavas were living in the Dhams in Vrindavan and Navadvip and Jagannath Puri. The idea of going to Calcutta was just not on the chart there. It was the domain of the zone of Maya, but Bhaktisiddhanta considered that wherever there is Maya, then that was his zone, to go there and bring the light, if you will, of Krishna consciousness that dissipates the darkness of Maya. So he built a marble temple there in Calcutta. But in the end, he related to Prabhupada that in essence, with every such effort, there's going to be some downside. And the downside was that he found some of the disciples living in the temple were arguing over which room would be theirs, which is not, what the place was for, if you will. So he reasoned, Saraswati Thakur at the time, if it got bad enough, you can just sell the thing, sell the marbles, and use the money to print books. Print book publishing was kind of like a softer form, as some have said, of institutionalization than, for example, the building of temples, opening a corporation, and so forth is. The latter, of course, facilitates persons participating, but participating ultimately in what? In what the books are talking about. So the Goswamis began to institutionalize the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through their writing. I've likened Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's the very personification of ecstasy that he was, to a great waterfall that you have to stand back from, and in awe and reverence. Here in North America, we have the Niagara Falls. In Latin America, there are many spectacular waterfalls that inspire us, invoke kind of an awe. So it was with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's ecstasy, particularly that which he expressed or manifested in the Antya Lila. It created some distance between himself and his disciples. They couldn't get close to him in his display or expression of Mahabhav. Sudipta Mahabhav, very inflamed, where the different sattvika bhavas all at once magnified in intensity, many times the likes of which has never been seen in the world, all occurring at once. His body couldn't contain, his perfected sadhaka daya couldn't contain all the prema and remain even serviceable, if you will, for him to act as a public figure and interact with his associates. So this created some distance. What was the point? So
institutionalization, soft heart of the teaching, institutionalization of the teaching.
Right. So I likened that ecstasy of Mahaprabhu to an extraordinary waterfall that you have to stand back from. That waterfall, the Goswamis turned into a lake in the form of their writing. So they made the waterfall accessible through excavation, if you will, and mining the sacred texts, and then locating Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in his ecstasy on the texts and in texts of their own, drawn from the larger corpus of sacred texts of the Hindus, the Shastra, the Shruti, the Smriti, and so forth. And in this way, they made him accessible in a kind of a softer form of institutionalizing the teachings, softer than the building of temples and forming an organization and all that's involved with that. And that latter form arises out of the former, and it is only as useful as it serves to further acquaint us with the core teachings and facilitates our putting them into practice. So it's possible that it could get in the way, an institution. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, as large of an institution as he formed, expressed that himself about that hard form of institutions. And over that, that's well and good, and we should try for that if we have the energy for that, or the order as Prabhupada took it, to try for, but not at the cost of the books. He wanted an ongoing current of commentary, which serves to keep the tradition alive, if you will, and up to date in consideration of time and circumstance. So the primary preoccupation of Prabhupada was his books, and within that, the bringing out the entirety of Srimad Bhagavatam. But, as I mentioned, Krishna couldn't wait for that. And so his Tirobhava, his disappearance from the world, is a day in which Krishna decided to fulfill his ambition, as it which I referred to in his poem aboard the Jaladuta, and bring him into the pastures and forests in the friendly embrace of Krishna and his friends, herding cows and so forth. This was his inner aspiration as expressed in his poem and outwardly expressed by him as his ideal. And it's notable, I believe, that Krishna chose to fulfill that ideal, bring him within his full embrace in the Braj Leela. Just as Prabhupada completed the second of 3 chapters in the Bhagavatam that put together are the build up to the actual event and afterthought of the event being referred to as the Brahma Vimohan Leela, the bewilderment of Brahma. It's notable in a couple of ways. But again, just to emphasize, we often is accustomed to refer to occasions like this as the Tirobhava. They don't say in Gaudiya tradition, we don't say the death, but rather the disappearance from our mortal vision, which would mean, of course, the appearance elsewhere, the appearance in the Leela itself that he's preoccupied with internally, writing about, in particular at this time, writing about Krishna's Sakya-rasa Leelas that burst really as jubilantly as you can imagine Sakya-rasa is, young boys with just a great enthusiasm for frolicking and inventing games playful sport and being free from the burden of parental oversight in the forest, which is just, what's behind the next tree, who can say? So much to explore, look under every rock, and adventure and so forth. The Bhagavatam with the Brahma Vimohan Leela bursts, the Sakyarasa bursts onto the scene in the Bhagavatam in this, there's this little precursor to it in the 11th chapter, but the 12th chapter just bursts onto the scene with the friends of Krishna planning a picnic in the forest, which would imply that they were going to stay out longer than they had been. This is just the end, the very end, the Seish Kumar, the end of his childhood Leela, when he's already herding calves and he's just about to turn into a cow herder and enter into his Poganda Leela. So if you study the language of the Bhagavatam, just the very language itself just underscores this, or just brings out this feeling of Sakyarasa bursting onto the scene. It's shocking to Jiva Goswami, who after the Brahma Vimohan Leela says, this is better than anything that's been written and said so far. Incredible. He's just staggered by that, thinking of it over and over again, the implications, both from a point of view of tattva and from the point of view of bhava. Jiva Goswami, of course, himself is steeped in Madhurya Rasa, in Manjari Bhava, but in his childhood, he worshipped Krishna and Balaram. Amongst all the Goswamis and the founding acharyas, no one has written with slight departures, if you will, from a focus on Madhurya Rasa and expressing appreciation for Sakyarasa more than Jiva Goswami. Very nice sections where he shows his fondness for that. And indeed, for that matter, in his Priti Sandarbha, unlike Rupa Goswami, he says that in Dwaraka, the Madhurya Rasa is mixed with Dasya, and in Braj it's mixed with Sakya. That's another big subject. I've written about that. We won't go into how that works. But he had some affinity for that rasa, which is, of course, highly compatible with Madhurya Rasa, especially when it reaches the pitch of the Narmasakas, who are so involved with Krishna's romantic affairs from a friendly perspective or vantage point. So this is where Prabhupada was. This is what he was writing about as the days of his disappearance approached. And just as he completed the second of those three chapters, he really wrote the 62nd, 63rd, and 64th verses of the 13th chapter of the Bhagavatam, which is the center chapter of these three that together make up the Brahma Vimohan Leela. Aghasura has been killed in the previous chapter. Now Brahma's coming in this chapter to see what that's all about. And of course, he becomes bewildered and enlightened at the same time. So the last three verses, Prabhupada wrote them in the same sitting. And I want to go into what that was like as well at the time. But the point I'm making at the moment is that with the conclusion of the 64th verse, the end of that 13th chapter, before the kind of epilogue, if you will, or the afterthought, the reflection of Brahma back on what happened, which constitutes the 14th chapter and his wonderful 30-some prayers in praise of Krishna, filled with bhava and perfect Gaudiya Siddhanta, especially with regard to establishing the foundational stone of Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. This is the Leela narrative in which that philosophical point is demonstrated. So there he ended, and at the 64th verse, and Krishna took him. He didn't die. Krishna took him. Krishna could not wait any longer. You can imagine then how internally absorbed he was in that ideal. In those days of that final section of his translating work, he longed. This was, of course, significantly during the Kartik month as well. He longed to, despite his physical condition, to mount a bullock cart and circumambulate Govardhan Hill with the coming, as it was in those days, building up to his passing of the Govardhan Puja Leela, the festivities surrounding that. He told us at the time, and I was there. This was going on, of course, for a period of about 6 weeks or so, where he was really moving in the direction of passing. His translation work was becoming more and more difficult due to his physical incapacitation, but still he persisted. And then, of course, the Kartik months came on. I was there about 5, I think, so weeks before he left. And I had come in May when he first went there to Vrindavan. He first went to Rishikesh for his health. And then I think he understood health is not getting better. So he followed his heart and went to Vrindavan. And that's the first time his disciples kind of who were with him in his immediate entourage, the word out that Prabhupada's physical condition is really deteriorating, and he could pass at any time. And it was in May in Vrindavan. It was very, very hot at that time. I went and spent the month of May there with him, and towards the end of the month, Pishima, Baba Tarini, Prabhupada's sister, came. And practically Prabhupada was only eating like Charnamrita. But she cooked some, what's that called? Where you burn the bottom of the pot. And anyway, Prabhupada liked, it's quite a rich preparation. She cooked some of that with puris because she knew Prabhupada loved it, and everybody was telling him, you can't cook that, he can't eat that, but he ate it. Some of it. And then we all thought, Pishima has cured him. He's better. He's well now. It's miraculous. And so, meanwhile, in the meantime, the mission, of course, was going on, and it had all types of concerns for both the foot soldiers and the leaders and so forth. So some of us, amongst them myself, returned to our preaching areas and whatnot. But then as the summer progressed and seasons changed again in September, July, rainy season, and then the autumn came, Prabhupada's condition deteriorated further. So I returned and spent a month or so, 6 weeks there with him. There at that time, we began the 24-hour kirtans. I had 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. was my shift. I was alone. I would come and chant just Hare Krishna Mahamantra. And I've told that story before, but I won't repeat it. But it was during that time, I also used to massage Prabhupada's feet in the day when he was on his bed. On one occasion, famously, of course, as you know, and I've repeated, I was doing so when he said, when he was asked by Tamal Krishna Maharaj if there's anyone we could get guidance from for arranging the samadhi, the funeral procedures should he pass. And he said for that, talk to Narayan Maharaj in Mathura. And then Tamal Krishna Maharaj, after he passed, he asked, is there anyone else we can consult? He said, for philosophy, as I was massaging Prabhupada's feet, B.R. Sridhar Maharaj of Navadvip, that kind of just like went in and never came out, went into my head, sent it down to my heart, and kept it there. And then when the opportunity arose, of course, it came out, and here I am, so much product of not only Prabhupada's association, Siksha, an example, but that of Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj as well. But on another occasion during that period, I was also massaging his feet, and the possibility of his passing and his age and so forth was being discussed. And Prabhupada said about death, he said, there is no death. And we are all young boys. There were only males in the room, but I think he would have said that even if there were females. He was, of course, from my perspective at the time, referring to his internal reality. One way was the way he related to us, and often I experienced him bringing what I considered bringing himself down from his inner reality to deal with the outer reality of whatever my relative concerns with regard to the preaching mission may have been, or need for instruction, and so forth. So yes, he envisioned himself as a young boy, and his passing from the world. This is Krishna's arrangement, and he took him just at the end of the Brahma Vimohan Leela, which is a nice time also, because after it ends with the prayers in one sense, but the bewilderment of Brahma ends at this point. And then Krishna carries on, goes back to his normal play, and all of the boys rejoin him at that time, right? When Brahma came, he wanted to steal. His idea was to kidnap the boys and the calves, first one, then the other. As the calves strayed from the picnicking that Prabhupada repeatedly aspired to express an aspiration to enter into. This is a very extraordinary picnic, because he who is Yagnabhuk, the enjoyer, who doesn't eat or eats by sacrifice, was actually eating. Brahma knew him as he who eats by sacrifice. You make a sacrifice and he eats, I guess. But here was actually eating, and eating in an extraordinary way by placing food in his mouth, tasting it, sharing it with other boys. As I've said on other occasions, the boys would taste from the many preparations, exchanging them with one another from their different plates. Whatever they tasted, they thought was super excellent, they would put it in Krishna's mouth as if it was a second tongue of their own. And whatever tasted second best, they would place in the mouth of another cowherd boy. Whatever tasted third best, they would taste themselves. But each cowherd had different sensibilities. So as everything got passed around, everything was considered the best. And Brahma saw this, and he wasn't sure if the Krishna he was seeing in Gopavesh was the same Krishna in Gopavesh dressed as a Gopa who appeared before him, showing the Gyan Mudra, exhibiting the Gyan Mudra, and giving Upanishadic wisdom in the 4 essential verses of the Bhagavatam, which is Shruti Saram Ekam, which is the essence of the Upanishads themselves. It's one thing if he's dressed like a coward, which is peculiar in itself, but then speaking like a real guru, and maybe was oblivious to his external appearance, it could be thought. But here he was in a Gopavesh and acting like a Gopa. And a Gopa who didn't know better how to, as in childhood, your mother has to teach you, no, don't put that in his mouth, no, put that in your, don't eat like that. Don't spill that, don't eat this is better for you. So without that kind of overbearing supervision, there he was. And Brahma thought maybe he's an imposter. That was his offense. For a moment, maybe he's an imposter in his mind. And so he wanted to test him. So he thought to separate, when the calves separated, he'd steal the calves. And when Krishna went after the calves, he'd steal the boys. Of course, what happened was Krishna, the boys, and the calves all remained in one prakash, one like window or section of the Leela that Brahma was not permitted to enter into. And for a year, it just continued. The minute that, anyway, for a year it continued. And meanwhile, separate from that, a facsimile of the boys was hidden, and the calves and so forth. So when Prabhupada's translation is ending, then all of the opulence that Krishna showed in the Leela, again, demonstrating through the narrative, through the practical example, that Krishna is tu Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This, Jiva Goswami says, is the Paribhas Sutra. It's kind of the password to unlocking the program for building a temple of bhakti in the heart, a rag bhakti temple. Krishna's Ham sarva se prabhavo matasavam pravartate iti mat bhavajante mam Buddha bhava samanvita, as Pujapat Maharaj would say, raga bhava samanvita. To enter there, you have to get this point straight. Krishna is the source of all, the fountainhead of all forms of divinity. He is determined to be such by the measure of rasa that we found in him, because after all, raso vaisaha, God is rasa. And the measure of rasa we find in him exceeds that we find in any other expression of divinity. He can, in the form of Krishna, reciprocate in love in all ways with his devotees. If you want to love unconditionally, without reservation, you have to be able to repose that love in a center that can fully take the love. Then you will experience the fullness of the idea that giving is the receiving. You'll experience the receiving in the context of giving, to the extent to which the giving is without reservation, number one, and you give yourself. But number two, that you give yourself to a source or to a center excuse me.
Yeah, your video is not now I can see you, Gurmash. Yeah, your image disappeared for a while. I didn't want to interrupt. Sorry.
Okay. A center that can actually take the love. So this of course philosophically we come to the conclusion this is Krishna. The statement is made in the third chapter of the first canto of the Bhagavatam, Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, after the description of a number of different avatars. But in the 10th canto, then, that teaching is played out in the form of the Leela in this particular Brahma Vimohan Leela. Because as you know, Krishna showed himself to be the source of all the worlds, of all the universes, of all the Narayans, that all the Mahavishnus manifest in all the different universes, all coming from him. That all this was inside of whatever was there, worthy of having, was to be found in Braj and more. Brahma saw all this, and then it all disappeared in a moment, in a flash. And there was Krishna just standing with a lump of rice and fruit in his left hand, looking as a bewildered cowherd as this four-headed fellow, golden fellow, stood before him and collapsed. He collapsed. At this point, what's happening, this is, of course, we're talking about this because this is what's happening. This is what Prabhupada's preoccupied with at the time of his passing. When the opulence, the Aishvarya disappeared, and the Madhurya took center stage, then the peacefulness of Vrindavan, Sukadev, in maybe the 59th verse, of that chapter used the word Samapriya, Sa, Priya, Ma. I think maybe Sanatana Prabhu says, Sahi, Brahma, Priya, dear, Ma, Radha. He started to become influenced by the influence of Radha that pervades the Braj. She is Bhakti Devi. As I've said before, there's a little bit of Radha in every devotee. We call that Ladini. He started to come from his Deva sensibilities to leave them behind. He's a big Deva, Brahma. Big person, right? In the world. So that worldly ego, he starts to leave behind by the influence of now the Hladini Shakti that is so central to the forming of the spiritual ego, the Bhakti Swarup with which we will participate ultimately in Leela Seva ourselves. So Brahma's, his example is there. He actually started to come under that influence. His spiritual ego in Sakya Ras started to manifest. Of course, this is not a Madhurya Ras Leela, the Brahma Vimohan Leela. It's Sakya Ras and also slightly Vatsalya Ras Leela. You can enter into Vatsalya Ras through this Leela when it manifests in the world, and obviously through Sakya Ras as well as arguably Brahma did. But he got off of his carrier, swan carrier, and he what? As now we go into the verses that Prabhupada was translating, 62, 63, 64. He touched the ground, Brahma. He touched down. What does it mean? It's said that the Devas never touched the ground. So it means that his Deva ego disappeared. Is dissipating now. And under the influence of the Hladini Shakti, he's developing this ego and bhava of a friend of Krishna, now being acquainted with the Vishayalambana, the actual form of Krishna that corresponds with the full expression of Sakya Ras, the Ashrayalambana, the friends of Krishna who personify it, and all the other ecstatic ingredients that were manifest through the boys. Their Anubhavas, their Sanchari Bhavs, and so on and so forth. He was getting like this very hands-on kind of entry into the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu's chapter on Bhakti Rasa, on Sakya Rasa. So the two things are converging here, and they're the two things that in one sense very much characterized Prabhupada. One thing is that is Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. This very much characterized Prabhupada. In his own words, he repeated this sutra again and again and again and again and again and again and again, with the translation, Krishna, comma, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. If you were an editor, you might think it's a little repetitious, Prabhupada. You might want to use different words here and there to say that, to get your point across, or you already made the point. Krishna is the Supreme Personality of God. You don't have to, every time you mention his name, you don't have to say that. Didn't do it every time, but a good part of the time. Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. So Prabhupada was repeating this again and again and again, this foundational stone, putting it in place. This characterized his whole campaign. Largely from the point of view of tattva. And so here he is now absorbed in this Leela, that in which this point is brought out in such a charming way, such a beautiful way, in such a convincing way. We can look at the grammar in the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto, Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam, and argue as Madhva does. That doesn't really mean that Krishna is the source of all avatars, or however someone else might deal with it, and so forth. And of course, we have our own Krishna Sandarbha, where Jiva Goswami's, the whole book is based on this Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam Sutra. It makes a pretty convincing theological argument in support of that notion. But here, in these chapters, it's undeniable. Some persons have tried to deny it by saying those chapters are not part of the original Bhagavatam. They're interpolated. They must have come in later on, because it doesn't just fit with our interpretation of the Bhagavatam, which doesn't put Krishna as the source of all expressions of divinity. But that's not a very good argument in itself. So the chapters, in no uncertain terms, demonstrate this to Brahma's 4 heads, all 4 of them, which, as these 3 verses that Prabhupada translated and commented on in one setting, which is the last setting that he participated in terms of his translation and commentary of the Bhagavatam. Brahma gets off of his goose, his swan, honker, they fly long distances, and he touches down on earth as the gods don't do. Now he's become human-like to enter the Leela, to become like Krishna, to enter his Leela. Some sense of equality here now is coming. In the midst of the Aishwarya, that's disappeared now. There's Krishna. And his 4 heads, with his 4 heads, he hits the ground. It's a problem for him, of course, because he wants to bow all 4 heads at once, but inevitably 2 are looking to the left and right, and 1 is looking up, and only 1 is looking down. And all of them, and all of the 8 eyes are weeping. With the heads, 1 head down at the feet of Krishna, weeping, he's bathing Krishna's lotus feet. In Aishwarya, you are the supreme personality of God. And with his other head on the back that's looking up, he sees the form of Krishna. He sees his face, his smiling face, and his Madhurya. Brahma's looking Madhurya and Aishwarya at the same time. From the Madhurya to Aishwarya, then he turns his head. So his head looking left, looking right, will be looking down. The one looking left will be looking up. This way, he turns his head around. Eventually, all 4 heads touch the feet of Krishna. All 4 heads look up at the same time, 1 down, 1 up at the same time, and see his face. And through understanding the tattva, Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swami, in the context of the setting of Sakyarasa, he enters in to the sweetness of Krishna Lila, and is now, of course, capable or in a position to speak the wonderful prayers, Brahma, that he does in the 14th chapter, fueled by his Baba, perfect Gaudiya Siddhanta, Tattva. And the center of those prayers, of course, he expresses his own affinity. Ho bhagyam, nanda gopa bachokasa, yan mitram paramanandam, purna brahma, sanatanam. Of course, I've written about this. I'll read it to you, the essence of his prayers. Praising those Ragatmika with Ragatmika Sakya Prem, and glorifying Braj, the coward kingdom of Nanda, as the domain of Sakyam, Brahma clearly stated that eternal, Sanatanam, friendship, Mitram, is the highest bliss, Paramanandam. At the same time, he explained that Krishna, as the complete expression of Brahman, Purna Brahma, is also himself the highest bliss, personified as one's eternal friend. Then, praising the residents of Braj in general and the cowherd boys in particular, he expressed his longing in Sambandhanuga Bhakti to reside therein by means of taking shelter of their lotus feet. He did not pray directly for Krishna to bless him to become a cowherd, but rather he prayed to attain the dust from the feet of the residents of Braj, Jad Gokule Pi Katamangri Raja Abhishekam. He prayed, that is, to attain the dust of their feet, their grace, and that of the cowherd boys in particular, who were right there, Iha Atabhyam, in that very forest, in the midst of Krishna's cowherding, which serves as a portal to eternal friendship, Brahma knowing that the good fortune, Buddhi Bhagyam, of Rag Bhakti is only attained by the grace of such devotees. In other words, he showed his skill in bhajan as he longed for Bhava Bhakti by way of not asking directly Krishna to be blessed, but trying to get the shelter of the feet of the Ragatmikas, in this case, Krishna's friends. And then, of course, he concludes his prayers with Nam Sankirtan, Shri Krishna, Vishnu, Kula, etc. This is an overview of a couple of verses, but primarily centered on the central verse of that 30-some verses of Brahma in the 14th chapter. So what we find relevant to Prabhupada, of course, here is that he left the world in this chapter having written his commentary on something that throughout his teaching he emphasized over and over and over again. And he kind of completed it here with because again, in no uncertain terms, it's brought out. And it's such an important point of philosophy for Gaudiya Vaishnavas. So from the point of view of Tattva, and then from the point of view of Bhava, this is the chapter where this Sakirasa really bursts, as I said earlier, onto the scene. And clearly this was Prabhupada's ideal. So Krishna is took him from the world right in the midst, right at the perfect point. This is the point again when in the Leela that he's writing about, everything in Vrindavan is returned to normal. Brahma is stunned. He pays his obeisances, and ultimately all of Krishna's friends reassemble with him and carry on with the Leela. And amongst them, Abhaycharanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada is fully in the fold. He's shown an entry point here, a portal in the Bhagavatam Leela. We feel that this is the point where he entered into that Leela. So it's I thought it would be a little of interest to the devotees to speak a little bit about this in terms of Prabhupada's passing, and again, what arguably he was internally and principally preoccupied with. We get the hint from all of this, the kind of way I'm speaking about this, to then, for those so interested, especially his disciples, to follow him where he is. Where is he? Is he now to be called on to decide whether women should be gurus or not? I mean, this is not This is not, what would he say now? What would he do now? What did he say then? What was he doing then? Where did he go? Where is he now? The more we become thoughtfully and appropriately preoccupied relative to our sadhana, in at least by attaching ourselves to and serving devotees who have more adhikar for entering there, if not entering there ourselves, the more this is our preoccupation, the more all the relative issues, problems, concerns will dissipate and disappear altogether. Just like the whole, you can imagine how preoccupied with the world Brahma was. It all has disappeared in this Leela. It all disappeared. Who's going to be president? Who's not? Who? We care on a relative level, but otherwise, who cares? There are more important things to think about, but only think about that if it gets in the way of thinking about what's important. To the extent that it does, we may have to bring it up, and so on. So these are a few thoughts I had, and it's just kind of scratching the surface again of Prabhupada's preoccupation at the time of passing. I wanted to, and I will now try to conclude with this, relate, which is of interest, how it is that Prabhupada wrote these verses, which gives you some idea of how he wrote all of his commentary, which is quite different, I think, than how most devotees think he wrote it. Is it either now extreme circumstances, because Prabhupada is very physically incapacitated, so he's using the dictaphone, but he can't even hold the dictaphone. So someone is holding it for him. And Pradyumna, who was his Sanskrit scholar, was doing the translations of the verses, which was not out of the ordinary, and then bringing them to Prabhupada, along with translations of the commentaries and what was being said, and then presenting it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was responding, yes, and this means this, and yes, and so forth. And then and Pradyumna would even say something like he said, for example, because Prabhupada is saying, yes, now the opulence has disappeared, and Krishna standing there, Dvibhuj Krishna, two-armed Krishna, human-like form. He said, yes, and this is Krishna. And then I think Pradyumna said at that time, yeah, in the Bible it said that God appears in, what does it say? In the image of, man is made in the image of God, something like that. So Prabhupada said, yes, and so he put that in the purport. In the Bible it said, man is made in the image of God. Yes. So this was, a suggestion or just a comment by Pradyumna that he picked up on. So the way in which he came to his, after that, of course, then that conversation between Prabhupada and Pradyumna, which was recorded, that was taken by Jayadvaita Swami, who kind of put it all together and wrote it up into the form of sentences and paragraphs, and amongst those involved at the time directly had it approved. Now these were extraordinary circumstances, but they're not that different from how Prabhupada wrote his Bhagavatam, or the spirit in which he wrote his Bhagavatam. Obviously, Pradyumna wasn't always there telling him this is exactly what is said here, because Prabhupada couldn't take the time to read the commentary himself. He would read the commentary himself ordinarily, but he would, drawing from the commentaries and then his own feeling, he would write something, but it wasn't without openness to any suggestion that might come along. Now, for the most part, the devotees didn't have any suggestions. They didn't know what to say. But if they did, as in this case, Pradyumna did, he readily gave suggestions and said, no, that doesn't say that, it says this, or maybe that. And Prabhupada was taking it into consideration and writing it. I say this because it's often thought almost like Prabhupada just closed his eyes and the pen just moved and he wrote it and don't change any word. and so forth. And I wrote something. I had wasn't sure. I was pretty exactly which verse Prabhupada ended with, and the text indicates the 64th verse. But so I posted on this forum on the Facebook for Prabhupada's disciples. Anybody had any information about that? And then it ended up into an interesting discussion, which lent, I thought, and was appreciated, me posting a couple of comments from my book on the Brahma Vimohan Leela. And then someone said, oh, looks like you wrote this after consulting other commentaries. I said, yeah, of course. That's what Prabhupada did. It's almost like, well, it's not fair. You consulted other commentaries here. And of course I did. I consulted other commentaries. And I often cite them as well, but then, there's an amalgamation, and then your own feeling is expressed. And then you send it to somebody else and say, what do you think, Maharaj? And he says, that sounds great, but this part over here, you might have thought about this. Then maybe you add that. This is actually the way in which Prabhupada wrote his books, or would have that much more had we, his disciples, been qualified enough to make comments, to give feedback, and so forth. And this is the way the Goswamis wrote their books. I just think this is an interesting point as an aside. Jiva Goswami wrote commentaries on Rupa Goswami, commentary on Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. They were writing books at the same time. Surely they shared them with one another and got feedback and so on and so forth, which demonstrates the fact that there's some relativity to it. There's more than one correct way to say things. There are different feelings that will be expressed that have never been expressed before, ways of speaking about the Leela that previously weren't spoken about, details and so forth that arise from the feelings of devotees who have feelings for these things. And of course, the standard is, whether they're correct or not, you want to get away from this objective, it was exactly like this, which is sometimes how some of Prabhupada's disciples think about it. The Leela happened exactly like this. As he wrote about it, any other way of saying it must be something wrong. But there's more than enough ways, more than one way in which it's correct and so forth. Even the Goswamis have written about the same Leelas with different details at different times. So it's more subjective than objective, even while the subjectivity that comes out falls within the objective parameters of what is Rasa Tattva. So that's the standard. For example, we find in Chaitanya Charitamrita, when prayers were offered to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through the medium of Swarup Damodar, he would check to see if they were appropriate, correct in terms of Siddhanta, Tattva, and that in terms of Rasa, that they didn't include some abhas, rasabhas. But if they met this criterion, then another thing has been said about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that would be celebrated. Something like this. So this just speaks to the kind of ongoing dynamic nature of Krishna Leela, and it helps to, understanding this helps us to kind of helps us to separate ourselves from this overbearing, materialistic, philosophically speaking, materialistic Maha Mantra of objectivity, third person, objective, verifiable truth. Unless we have that, it's not true. It's not real. It's not actually happening. We don't have proof that you yourself exists, so it must not be there. This is like overbearing. Again, it's the Maha Mantra. Krishna's appearance in the world is not so much of a historical event as it is an event in the lives of devotees. Even if it is a historical reality, what they experience is not what everybody else experiences and would write about if they were writing about it in a critical historical way. Vyas saw something in Krishna Leela after going into meditation, then wrote about it poetically to express all that it meant to him. In Christianity, the focus is objectively, which is what's real. Not really, but that's how it's thought in the world. Christ appeared in history at this particular time and did this. This is too much emphasis on this is just playing into the Maha Mantra of materialism. So that's an important point, I believe, to consider. Again, that doesn't, but there's an objective criterion of what constitutes rasa tattva. Then within that, there are so many possibilities. And Prabhupada's life internally is one of those possibilities, certainly worth celebrating. And we follow him in his passing on this day through the text of Srimad Bhagavatam that he found himself preoccupied with at the time when Krishna brought him into his fold and fulfilled his ambition to enter into such a friendly Leela Seva. Bhagavan Shri Krishna ki jai. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Prabhupada Tirobhava Mahamotsavatiti ki jai. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanandi. Haribol. Jai.
Thank you for that. Really incredibly beautiful class. So did you want to take questions? Devotees are all muted. I think you can unmute yourselves. Shouldn't be able to, but I think you can. Try it, anybody. And if you can't, let me try something here.
If you have a question.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah, if anyone has a question. Oh, now you're muted. Wait a minute, Swami. Gotta get you unmuted. You have to unmute yourself, actually.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Well, I hope that you're all having some. Oh, I see a nice dog there in Finland. Looks very friendly. Krishna. What's his name?
This is Radha's.
Couldn't make that out.
This is Radha's dog Frodo.
Okay. Nice to meet you. So I hope you're all having some celebration in your homes and all getting together on this occasion.
This is our celebration.
You're our celebration.
Seeing you and hearing your class is our celebration.
Okay, well, that sounds good. That's good. It's nice to be with you all. I hope you're all staying safe. And I think do we have another talk during the Kartik?
Yes, we have one on Sunday for Gopastami.
Sunday, Gopastami. I think that's the third week of Kartik. Hopefully you've all accepted some commitment, some vrat for the month, and getting strength from fulfilling that going forward. And so I look forward then. Here's something. Someone has written it's a question. He says privately, but it's written on here. So on the topic of, this is from Ananta Govinda. On the topic of Prabhupada's sentiments, Sakirata, we know that he established worship of Krishna Balaram in Vrindavan, one of the most important temples he built. Are there any other temples where Krishna Balaram are worshipped as main deities? While traveling India, I never visited a temple where Krishna Balaram were worshipped. And Ananta Govinda asked, can I comment on this? It's a good question. Yes, Prabhupada established deities of Krishna and Balaram in Vrindavan, and the way they're standing with Krishna, with Balaram resting on the shoulder of Krishna, was the pose that came in Prabhupada's heart. He directed that, Hmm. And that pose, or just a very, very minor variation of that, has become a almost a standard form, sculpted form of Krishna and Balaram in temples around the world, wherever they are. Now that, of course, regard to your question, is arising out of Prabhupada's bhava and is mostly extended through the work of his disciples and grand disciples, and those influenced by him. So you have some Krishna Balaram temples in ISKCON. After that, I think there's one in Bhubaneswar. I know there's one in France, in a rural community in France called New Mayapur. There's Krishna Balaram deities there. I know there is a temple in Queens, one of the districts in New York, where Krishna Balaram deities have been established. And there are more. But again, this is after the Krishna Balaram temple. It's kind of following in the bhava of that, or the enthusiasm of that. But your question may also relate to prior to that and outside of Gaudiya Vaishnavism or within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Well, I did mention earlier that from the written record, it's clear that Jiva Goswami worshipped Krishna Balaram deities in his youth. And it's pretty uncommon, I would say, comparatively speaking, to, for example, Radha Krishna deities. By contrast, much more widely established form of the deity. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur established everywhere Radha and Krishna and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Radha Krishna Nahayanya, by way of saying Radha and Krishna, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Radha and Krishna combined, a very important point of philosophy. But there are some examples. And now where the deities of childhood deities of Jiva Goswami are, I don't know if they are, that's known, but it's there in the written record. In Vrindavan, this came up last week, or when we were talking about Govardhan Puja, on top of Govardhan Hill, there's a deity, well, it's a Govardhan Shila thought to be Balaram. Doka Dauji is his name. Cheating older brother, it means. There's a leela in which it said that he climbed to the top of Govardhan Hill and hid there to watch the Ras, the interaction, the Gopi Bhava, interaction between the gopis and Krishna, which he doesn't, he can't directly participate in, being the older brother. So in a cheating way, he got up on top there. So there's a deity of Balaram there. There's a famous Balaram deity in Vrindavan that whose temple was acquired by Pramod Puri Goswami Maharaj in recent times, in the 20th century, I believe. Very nice temple there now under the care of Bodhayan Maharaj, the successor of Pramod Puri Goswami. And that was a Balaram temple. There's some nice stories about the Balaram deity there, interaction with the previous owner who had established the temple, a man from Calcutta, a devotee from Calcutta, and passed away. And Puri Maharaj, did he add a deity of Krishna? I'm not sure. I think he might have added a deity of Mahaprabhu, who is Krishna, along with Balaram. But there are, maybe a few, but they're rare in comparison. And that's just the number of temples that since that time have been established with Krishna Balaram as the central deities or as deities along with other deities, as Prabhupada used to do, is considerable, which speaks to the power of the wave, if you will, of Sakyabhav that he was surfing the world on. So I
I
hope
have a
that
question.
helps. Yes, Mahar, go ahead.
I just wondered, since Prabhupada seemed to know everything, he knew his cowherd boy name and he knew a lot, would he still be going to one of the universes to take
Would he be going
birth
what?
and one of the different universes in the material world
Would he be
before
going?
he went to the
Prob-
spiritual world? Or,
Yeah, that's a spiritual world too. But Prabhupada, it's best for us to make that determination in the least without realization and experience on the basis of what he actually said about himself. And distance ourselves from what we might feel, especially if it proves to contradict what he said. So about himself, Prabhupada repeatedly said that he was born in a Vaishnava family because of his previous life's involvement with bhakti, that during which he had not completed the course, if you will, which he would then reference to with Bhagavad Gita, which speaks about two courses of devotees who, well, it's speaking about yoga, but ultimately the chapter is about bhakti yoga, and the whole discourse on the yoga of Krishna that carries from the middle of the second chapter to the end of the sixth chapter begins with bhakti and ends with bhakti. So it's appropriate to, as Prabhupada did, interpret those verses in the sixth chapter that speak about the yogi as he's speaking about a devotee as well that doesn't perfect himself. Either goes to heaven and then takes birth in a pious family, picks up where he or she left off, or takes birth in a Vaishnava family if they're more advanced in their practice, but haven't that perfected it. So probably repeatedly refer to that verse of the sixth chapter of the Bhagavatam in reference to himself. Now you could say, well, that's his humility and so forth. Really, he was, coming from Goloka Vrindavan. But again, we'd be safer just to go with what he said and what our sentiment might be. And what he said is not a small thing. Also, he said, Prabhupada once said, it took me 30 years to perfect the chanting. He told us that, so you may have a few years left, or, He also said that in my previous life, I was a doctor and I committed no sins. Do you remember that? Hearing that? So, I mean, we're going to say he just made these things up to be humble, or is that's what he said? So I just go with that. So if we go with that, then we look at Prabhupada as a sadhana siddha. When asked about nitya siddha versus sadhana siddha, which is better, which is worse, Prabhupada said, siddha means siddha. So that's the end of the story there. There is a difference between nitya siddhas and sadhana siddhas. But to say one is better than the other is a relative consideration. Nitya siddhas are the ones we will follow, the paradigmatic figures, Lalita, Vishaka, Sridham, Subal, and so forth, as may be the case. But following them itself is extraordinary, and it sets an example of how to follow the Ragatmikas for all of us. In his commentary on Brihad Bhagavatamrita, speaking about Prahlad in the first canto, Sanatana Goswami makes the point that the sadhana siddhas are better than the nitya siddhas. So again, it's relative. He says, why? Because like Prahlad, who he's looking at as a sadhana siddha there, he was tested, whereas the Ragatmikas, they never get tested. I mean, it's kind of silly in a sense, but it's just a way of glorifying Prahlad. So sadhana siddha is very glorious, and Prabhupada depicted himself as such repeatedly. And it stands to reason that for the most part, what we'll find in disciplic succession is sadhana siddhas, because when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, for example, appears, his associates come with him. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu departs, his associates go with him. If you think that they keep coming back again and all, maybe, but they're pretty attached to being with him, and he's pretty attached to being with them as well. I mean, there is a mention in Brihad Bhagavatamrita of devotees from Vaikuntha being sent out for canvassing in the world, who could be arguably Nityasiddhas. But Vaikuntha is different than Goloka. They don't have the same attachment to Narayan that Krishna's friends and lovers have for him. It makes it pretty difficult for them to leave there for preaching, if you will. So one could argue like that. But given what Prabhupada said about himself, then I would think that as is shown in the texts, the sages of Dandakaranya, they were culturing Gopi Bhav, and they took birth in the Prakat Leela. The presiding deities of the Upanishads, similarly, they took birth in the Prakat Leela. Other examples are given by Goswamis in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and in the commentaries of Sakyarasa and Vatsalya Rasa, which those cultivating those bhavas took birth in the Prakat Leela, and that was a portal. There are exceptions, you could say, to the rule, because we find that Gopakumar, the protagonist of the second canto of Gopal Champu, doesn't take birth in the Prakat Leela. He's living in Braj, meditating on the Leela, on the Prakat Leela, and he goes directly to the Aprakat Leela. But that would be seen as I would say, an exception, because there are features of the Sthayi Bhavs in Braj or developments of them, intensifications of them, that are next to impossible to develop outside of having a direct association of those who are experiencing those developments or intensifications of their Sthayi Bhav. So based on that, it would be reasonable to conclude that, and you say, well, he knew who he was, he knew his name, he knew everything. Wouldn't he just go directly to Goloka? No, those things are required for going to the Prakat Leela. Of course, you can find out more when you go there as well. You have a general idea. You could think of that Nanda Maharaj is my father. Yashoda is my mother, because they're the mother and father of every boy in Braj, every girl in Braj, even though they have their own fathers and mothers as well. Possible. We find Gopakumar went there. He didn't know who his father and mother was, and Krishna in his own way showed him, go home with Sri Ram. After breakfast, go back, get ready for cow herding, go home with Sri Ram, and then return. Indicating that you're in Sri Ram's family, go there. So the Prakat Leela, some wonderful things details could be added to your what's called Swarup Siddhi, that you can enter into the Vastu Siddhi, Prakat Leela. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Guru Maharaj, there
Yes.
is one question sent via Facebook by Annapurna. So
Oh.
she's asking, she's saying in the Spanish streaming, she says, you say that Prabhupada along his life, he showed constantly his mood. So how is that he was able to speak so much about Madhurya to the point that some devotees thought that he was a gopi? Could you share some thoughts on that?
Yes, sí, cómo no.
Okay, let me 5 seconds translate that into Spanish.
Sí.
Okay, Guru Maharaj, thank you.
The fact is that Prabhupada did not speak so much about Gopi Bhav that some of his disciples thought he was in Gopi Bhav. He spoke about Gopi Bhav in a broad way, in terms of Rasa Tattva, by saying, and this is the highest ideal, and this is the highest ideal. He made that clear. As Gopakumar does, for example, in the second canto of Brihad Bhagavatamrita, even though his own bhav is that of a Narmasaka. And as in the first canto of Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Narada, who's the expansion of Madhu Mangal, and who, according to Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, is in Sakyarasa himself, he points out the highest ideal is the love of the gopis. So Prabhupada pointed that out, but he didn't speak about Gopi Bhav to such an extent that some of his disciples began to think he was a gopi. The fact of the matter is, most of his disciples who thought about it thought that he was in Gopa Bhav, in Sakya Bhav. Let me give you an example of a prominent disciple of Prabhupada that comes to mind. My god sister, Jadurani, who later was affectionately referred to by her Siksha Guru, Pujapad Bhaktivedanta Narayan Maharaj, as Shamarani. She was under the impression, just from associating with Prabhupada and from the things that he said and so forth and wrote, that Prabhupada was in Sakyarasa. Until she met Narayan Maharaj and came under his influence. When she came under Narayan Maharaj's influence, Narayan Maharaj is very much preoccupied with Gopi Bhav, Manjari Bhav, and with the fact that this is the highest ideal of the Sampradaya, and it is the prominent, by far, influence in Gaudiya Sampradaya.
The video turned off, Guru Maharaj, sorry.
Oh, I think it ran out of, I don't know why. Let me see if I can fix it.
Okay, if not, we continue like that.
Yeah, it ran out of batteries, I think.
Okay, no problem. I continue with the translation, they can hear me.
Yes.
No problem.
So Narayan Maharaj spoke about Madhurya Bhav, Gopi Bhav, and so forth as the highest ideal. And he assumed that Prabhupada must have had that ideal. But he was not privy to or aware of all of the things that Prabhupada said, the poems that he wrote, the things that he said in conversations at different times and so forth, the likes of which we put together in the book penned by Bhaktivedanta Ashram Maharaj, entitled Oh My Friend, which has been translated in Spanish. It's about to be published in Spanish. So he wasn't aware of all that information, which is overwhelming documentation of, in Prabhupada's own words, and just reflecting on them as to Prabhupada's ideal. And when late in his own life, Bhaktivedanta Narayan Maharaj was offered that, he didn't even want to entertain it, because he had already said over and over again, Prabhupada must be in Madhurya Bhav. He must be, because this is the main theme of the Sampradaya, and my Guru Maharaj is in Madhurya Bhav. He took sannyas from him, and so forth, and so on. If he was really acquainted with all the information, I think he would have had a nuanced opinion. But under, anyway, his influence, not under Prabhupada, not based on anything that Prabhupada had said, only based on what Narayan Maharaj had said, Shamarani took the position that Prabhupada must be in Gopi Bhav. Similarly, after Prabhupada's passing, Pujapad Srila Maharaj became a prominent person in the world scene. He was preoccupied with or idealized Madhurya Rasa, Manjari Bhav. He talked about that a little bit and so forth in ways that some of Prabhupada's disciples under his guidance had not heard before. And he honed a little bit their understanding of what the highest ideal was and so forth. And some of those devotees under his influence and association became attracted to the ideal of Madhurya Rasa. But the difference between Narayan Maharaj in this regard and Sridhar Maharaj is that Sridhar Maharaj was privy to some of the things that Prabhupada had said in his poem on the Jaladusa in particular. He had it memorized by heart. And he was of the strong opinion that Prabhupada was in Sakirasa. So those under Sridhar Maharaj's influence who became attracted to Madhurya Rasa never thought that Prabhupada was also was in Gopi Bhav. But so therefore, the interest largely, to a large extent, in Gopi Bhav amongst Prabhupada's disciples comes from association with devotees after the passing of Prabhupada. Not entirely, but to a large extent. There was some interest in Gopi Bhav within ISKCON before Prabhupada passed that he didn't approve of. He questioned the way it was being thought about on the part of some of his disciples. But that influence, I should say, also came from outside of Prabhupada, came from Radhakund. So the idea that Prabhupada is in Gopi Bhav, that doesn't come from Prabhupada. No one could get that just from associating with Prabhupada. The idea that Gopi Bhav is the highest ideal, you could get that from associating with Prabhupada. That's true. And as I often say, Gaudiya Sampradaya is just saturated with Manjari Bhav. So being acquainted with the books, the texts, and so forth that he translated, one could come to that conclusion. This is the highest ideal, and hone one's sadhana in that direction, no problem. But that Prabhupada is in that bhava, that's not something you could draw from there. And I don't think too many, if any, devotees that I know of ever thought that from things that Prabhupada said. I mean, he said nothing about it, where he said so many things about himself in terms of Sakirasa. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay, so we talked a bit now. I think we should stop and hopefully we'll all get together again on Sunday for Gopastami. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Gaur Premanandi.